The night Ruby Williams died, Harlem stopped breathing, because everyone knew that when innocence is murdered in the dark, something far worse wakes up with the dawn. The streetlights flickered like they were unsure whether to stay awake, and the sidewalks, usually loud with jokes and arguments, fell into a stunned quiet that felt wrong for a neighborhood that never slept. Ruby was 18 years old, the kind of girl people remembered because she smiled at strangers and said, "Excuse me," even when no one was in her way. She had just finished a late shift helping her aunt at a corner diner and was walking home with a small paper bag of groceries pressed to her chest, humming softly to keep herself company. She took the same route every night, past the barber shop with the cracked window, past the brownstone where an old man sat on the steps even in winter, past the alley everyone warned her about, but she'd never been afraid. That night, the air was cold and sharp, and her breath made little clouds as she turned the corner. That's when the car came flying in too fast, tires screaming in protest as it slid sideways and blocked the street. For a split second, Ruby thought it was an accident. She even stepped forward ready to help. Three men jumped out. There was no demand for money, no shaky threat, just laughter that didn't belong on a quiet block, and eyes that looked right through her, like she wasn't human at all. Grocery bags slipped from her hands, an apple rolling into the gutter. Ruby opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never had a chance to become real. The gunshot cracked the night wide open, sharp and final, echoing off brick walls and fire escapes. By the time her body hit the pavement, the car was already gone, swallowed by the city like it had never. Doors stayed shut. People peeked through curtains, hearts pounding, knowing exactly what they had heard and exactly what it would cost to speak. Sirens came late, almost embarrassed, and the police chalked the outline while neighbors stood at a distance, silent and shaking. Someone covered Ruby with a coat. Someone else picked up the apple and set it gently beside her, as if that small kindness might undo the damage. By morning, her name moved faster than the news. Ruby Williams, 18, no trouble, no enemies, just a girl who didn't make it home. On stoops and in shops, people whispered her name like a prayer and a warning. Mothers pulled their children closer. Fathers clenched their jaws. Everyone asked the same question without saying it out loud. Who would answer for this? Before noon, the newspaper landed on Bumpy Johnson's table. He read the article once, slowly, his eyes stopping at her age, then at the word unidentified. The room around him waited. Men who feared nothing held their breath. Bumpy folded the paper with care, as if it was something fragile, and stood up. His face showed no anger, no shock, just a calm so deep it was unsettling. 3 days, he said softly. No explanation followed. None was needed. In Harlem, everyone knew what those words meant. When the law forgot a child, something older and colder stepped in to remember. And somewhere in the city, the men who laughed that night had no idea their time had already begun to run out. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops on the first of those 3 days, Harlem had begun to move differently, like a body reacting to a wound. Nothing obvious changed. Stores still opened, buses still ran, music still leaked from windows. But underneath it all, there was tension, a quiet awareness that something was unfolding. Bumpy Johnson didn't issue threats or make speeches. He didn't need to. His name traveled faster than his voice ever could, and the message was simple. Someone had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The first whispers started in places no police officer ever thought to look. A shoeshine man heard two drunks arguing about a car that had been borrowed the night before and never brought back. A woman who cleaned offices downtown mentioned a bloodstain she'd seen hastily scrubbed from the back seat of a sedan. A dock worker overheard a nervous phone call about keeping quiet and leaving town for a while. None of it seemed important on its own, but Bumpy had built his power on listening to fragments and turning them into truth. By the second night, the fragments were forming a picture. Names floated in the air and settled where they were meant to. A bartender wiped down the same glass for 10 minutes while remembering a familiar face bragging too loudly about teaching someone a lesson. A mechanic suddenly recalled fixing a dented bumper at dawn, no questions asked, cash only. Each memory carried fear with it, because everyone understood that silence no longer meant safety. Silence now meant choosing a side. The man nodded, sweating, and talked until his voice cracked. By midnight, Bumpy knew the car, the street, and the names of the men who had laughed before they fired. The strange thing was what happened next. The police, who usually rushed to prove authority, slowed down. Tips went missing. Reports were filed incorrectly. A patrol car that should have followed up on a lead never showed. It wasn't bribery, not directly. It was pressure, the kind that comes when an entire community exhales in the same direction. Officers who lived nearby felt it. They heard it in their own buildings, in their own kitchens. Some crimes they understood solved themselves, and touching them only brought trouble. Meanwhile, the men responsible felt the city closing in. Friends stopped answering calls. Safe houses weren't safe anymore. Every footstep behind them sounded too close. One of them tried to drink away the fear and ended up confessing to the wrong person. Another packed a bag and realized no one was willing to drive him anywhere. Harlem had made a decision, and it was unanimous. By the end of the second day, Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a single, slow breath. The work was almost done. He hadn't pulled a trigger or ordered a beating. He had simply reminded the city of its own rules, the ones written long before badges and courts decided who mattered. Ruby Williams' name was no longer just a whisper. It was a weight pressing down on the guilty, and there was nowhere left for them to stand without feeling it. The third day arrived quietly, almost gently, as if the city itself wanted the ending to happen without noise. Morning light slid across Harlem's bricks and windows, and for the first time since Ruby Williams died, people stepped outside without that tight knot in their chests. They didn't know the details, but they felt the shift. Something had settled. Something had been decided. Ruby's mother woke before dawn, the way grief trains you to do. Sleep had become a stranger since the night her daughter didn't come home. When she opened her door to fetch the newspaper, she saw the envelope resting on the mat. Plain, unmarked, placed with care. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was the exact amount of money Ruby had been carrying for groceries, every bill smoothed flat, every coin counted. Beneath it lay a small card with a single sentence written in steady ink. She will not be forgotten. Her knees buckled, and she sat right there on the floor, crying, not just from pain, but from the strange, overwhelming knowledge that someone had seen her daughter as more than a statistic. Across town, 3 men waited in a cramped apartment, blinds drawn, nerves shredded thin. They hadn't slept. Every sound made them flinch. By noon, a message reached them through a friend who refused to meet their eyes. No threats, no instructions, just a simple truth. Leave. They didn't argue. They didn't ask where to go. Fear had taught them obedience better than any weapon ever could. That evening, they boarded a bus heading out of the city, carrying nothing but small bags and the certainty that they could never come back. No one stopped them. No one followed. By the next morning, their names were already fading, erased from conversations like chalk washed off a sidewalk. Harlem had no use for them anymore. The police closed the case with an almost embarrassed efficiency. The file was labeled unsolved, then quietly buried under newer problems, louder crimes, easier targets. There were no press conferences, no promises of justice. Officially, Ruby Williams became another unanswered question. Unofficially, everyone knew the answer, and that knowledge was enough. That night, Bumpy Johnson sat alone by his window, the city humming below him. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He thought about Ruby, about how young 18 really was, about how many dreams fit inside that number, and how easily they could be stolen. Power, he knew, wasn't about control or fear. It was about responsibility, about stepping in when the world looked away. He poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. Somewhere, a mother was sleeping for the first time in days, knowing her daughter mattered. Somewhere, the streets were a little quieter, not from fear, but from respect. Bumpy understood that his name would never appear in a history book beside Ruby's, and that was exactly how it had to be. By morning, Harlem would return to its rhythm. Laughter would come back, music would spill into the streets again. But beneath it all, a lesson would remain, passed down without words. Innocence is not free, and when it is taken, the city remembers who it belongs to. Ruby Williams' life had been short, her death cruel. But her story ended with balance, and in a world that rarely offered that, it was the closest thing to justice anyone was ever going to get.